Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. Thanks for tuning in to today's FP Insider conference call on the coronavirus pandemic and the global economy. We're going to get started in just 1 minute as we wait for everyone to get settled in. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our FP Insider conference call on the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic. I hope you're well, safe, and healthy. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Managing Editor at Foreign Policy, and your host for the next 30 minutes. This call is part of FP's regular series of interactive discussions for Insider subscribers, where we bring in expert guests to discuss vital issues at the intersection of policy and business. Today, we have two blockbuster guests to discuss the world economy after the pandemic. We're going to look at stimulus measures by governments, who has the best model, and what more can be done. But before all of that, some housekeeping notes in this era of virtual gatherings. We want you to ask questions. For those of you logged in via the Zoom app, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Click that button, submit your questions, and I'll put them to our guests live. When you ask a question, be sure to provide your name, organization, and your location, country, and I will read those out as well. If you're having trouble with Zoom, please join our live stream. That's on foreignpolicy.com/live and click on the link for this event. If that's how you're joining us, you can email us questions to web@foreignpolicy.com. Okay, let's get started. We have several hundred participants already. My guests today have extensive experience in economic analysis and policy making. Raghuram Rajan is the former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He's also the former governor of India's central bank, and today he's a professor at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Rajan is also the author of one of the main essays in FP's forthcoming print issue, Is This the End of Globalization? That just went online on our website today, and I urge you to read it. We're also joined by Adam Posen, who has been president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics since January 2013. He worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the 1990s and later at the Bank of England, notably during the last financial crisis. So let's dive in. The US job numbers just came in this morning with the unemployment rate jumping to 4.4%. But that's a number that will almost certainly rise higher given that 10 million Americans have filed for unemployment in the last few weeks. The hopeful scenario is that the economy will go into deep freeze. And when this public health crisis is over, people can go back to work, demand will return, and life snaps back to normal. The more grim scenario is that between job losses, bankruptcies, the collapse of industries, and maybe even nations, the new normal could be very different indeed. So let's start with Raghuram Rajan. Raghu, I want to ask you about the $2.2 trillion stimulus plan passed by the US Congress. Looking solely at the US economy, is it big enough?
Well, we don't know. We have to wait and see. I think the good news is it tackles all the important areas. When combined with the Federal Reserve's initiatives, there's plenty of credit available if it can be rolled out in time. There are incentives for small and medium businesses to keep their workers on. There are direct transfers to people so that they can keep body and soul together over this period. And unemployment benefits have been increased. So on the fiscal side as well as on the monetary side, there's been tremendous action. The whole idea here is to induce a coma in the economy, keep it sort of in suspended animation for some time until these measures can be lifted, and then hope that we can reawaken the economy and it sort of gets back into action quickly. Of course, a lot depends on how long the pandemic fight will take, and of course, whether at the end of it, the patient will be strong enough to wake up.
Got it. Well, let me put the same question to Adam. Do you think that the 2.2 trillion figure is enough? The fact that there are so many millions of people who are already unemployed, who for whom there may be delays in accessing some of the payments that have been promised, for whom after this is all over, life may never return back to normal. What do you think of this stimulus package so far? And do you think we'll need more down the line?
I think it's possible we'll need more down the line, Ravi, but I don't view that as a big deal. I think, like Raghu, the basic principles and targeting of the US plan is very good. The scale at close to around 10% of GDP is enormous. That doesn't mean it's too much, it's not, but it's the right order of magnitude. And I think people are going to be pleasantly surprised in a sense how effective this will be. There are inherent limitations because small businesses, cash flow dependent businesses, and the people who work for them in the affected sectors especially, there's just no way to get the money fast enough. We're going to be getting the money, I shouldn't say we, the US government will be getting the money within a few weeks, which is amazingly quick. If you compare this, as my colleague Jason Furman has pointed out, in both speed and scale to the stimulus response in 2008, 2009 in the US, it's night and day. And Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin genuinely deserve credit. The other thing where it is going to be somewhat disappointing is we do not inherently have the right structures of an unemployment system the way Europe does. And so probably there are going to be more permanently lost jobs for the given situation than in, say, France or Germany, where they have these short work programs that can more directly keep people in the jobs while providing them with government subsidies.
Got it. Thanks for that. Raghu, what other options do central banks around the world actually have at this point? I mean, rates have been slashed across the board. A lot of liquidity has been injected into the system already. What other options are in the toolkit?
Well, there's a huge difference between developed country central banks and developing country or emerging market central banks. In industrial countries, rates are pretty much at zero, and they can essentially flood the market with liquidity, buy anything that they want to buy, and there will be modest consequences because at zero interest rates, money is like bonds. So central banks can expand their balance sheets tremendously, and that's what they're doing, whether in the UK, the US Fed. I mean, the US Fed has moved into buying bonds issued by firms directly. That's something it didn't do the last time around. And so these are extraordinary measures across the industrial world. More problematic are emerging markets where, on the one hand, you do want to supply as much liquidity and enhance credit as you can, but on the other hand, you have to keep watching both your exchange rate as well as capital flows to make sure that you don't have capital flight. A number of emerging markets are in some difficulty. We've already seen Ecuador talk about defaulting. So we will see more stress in the emerging market system going forward, and it's not clear that central banks have as much room there.
Raghu, let me push you a little bit more on emerging markets, because what's strange here is that, you know, for countries like Brazil, India, Malaysia, South Africa, other African countries, the financial crisis for them has actually arrived before wide community spread of the coronavirus itself. So purely in financial terms, what do you see as the main pressure points to look out for those economies?
Well, it differs economy by economy, of course. I mean, if you take those two countries, Brazil and India, they already had fairly strained fiscal situations. And so their ability to expand, as Adam said, 10% of GDP in the US, they simply don't have the ability to spend that kind of money to deal with the problem, even if they were seized of the matter in the same way as the US Congress has been. So they have to be much more careful. What do they actually spend money on? How do they do the best they can in inducing the coma for a few months?
Got it. Adam, there are so many interesting models of how countries are dealing with this crisis. I mean, in Denmark, for example, the government is covering, I think, between 75 and 90% of all workers' salaries for the next 3 months, as long as those companies refrain from layoffs. In the UK, the government is covering about 80% of wages, including for the self-employed. The Netherlands has 90% coverage. I know you're broadly in favor of what the United States has done, but just looking around the world, which economy do you think is playing its cards right?
Well, two of the ones you mentioned, Ravi, Denmark and the UK, are paying their cards very well on the economic policy front. But I think the amount of distinction between the rich economies on the policy front is actually reasonably limited. And what matters at least as much, of course, is the public health responses. I know you've discussed on previous calls. In the US and the UK, less so than in some of the Europeans and some of the East Asian economies, they've screwed it up, to put it bluntly, and they've made reversals which were necessary. But whether the extent of testing, the speed of testing, the extent of lockdown is properly being enforced and monitored is a very open question. So the UK, for example, may be getting monetary fiscal coordination along with bank issues almost right in some sense, and in scale too, and the currency is held up. But it's not a good news scenario. It may all be for naught because of, I shouldn't say for naught, but it may be much less effective in speeding a recovery, speeding the end of the coma that Raghu and others have mentioned because of the public health errors. I think everyone on this call is aware of what the Trump administration has done falsely and misleadingly on that part, unfortunately. I would also just point out that Raghu is absolutely right, of course. The biggest divide here is the developing countries, the poorer world, and the rich world, the North and the South, as it were. What is scary is there are a couple major emerging markets, notably Brazil and Mexico, which for a variety of reasons, including size and financial markets, could be like the rich countries, could pull it off, but they're choosing to mess up on the public health front, just like the US and UK did, or I shouldn't say they, their government leadership are. And so that may overwhelm even very well-designed economic policies.
Adam, you worked on monetary policy in Britain years ago, and so you have, I think, a very strong sense of what their abilities are there. And I guess what I want to push you on is, do you think, given how aggressive the British government was in trying to sort of cover wages, including for the self-employed, do you think that that is something that other advanced economies could do as well?
I think they can. I think, the one bit of scary news we saw today beyond the human litany was that Singapore is going to a much more aggressive lockdown suddenly. And that raises the issue that even countries we thought were doing well may have not managed the virus as successfully as we thought. And that may be less about their management and more about learning about the nature of the virus. But so when we talk about this kind of replacement of salary, one has to keep an eye on how long this is going to be for. As long as it is something for 3, 4, possibly even 6 months, I fully believe that the rich countries can afford it and should do it. And as I said, I think the US needs to develop structures, as many people are trying to do, similar to what the UK or continental Europeans are doing. If we think the virus is not going to be able to be controlled in the sense of some palliatives, eventually a vaccine, and especially an ability to test people and track people for whether they have antibodies successfully, then it becomes a different picture. So I think we also need to be looking at what's the testing stage or the signals at which point democracies need to reconsider. But for now, absolutely follow the British, the French model, the Danish model, support your workers as much as possible, in place as much as possible.
There's so much that's unknown here, given that we don't know when the public health crisis will end, which is why we don't know when the economic crisis will end. We're getting in a lot of questions from our audience. For those of you who've just joined us, We're in conversation with Raghuram Rajan and Adam Posen about the global economy in the time of this pandemic. If you want to ask a question and you're on Zoom, just click on Q&A at the bottom of the app, type in your question, and I'll try and come to you in a bit. If you're watching on YouTube, it's foreignpolicy.com/live. You can email us at web@foreignpolicy.com. Before I get to some of those questions, Raghu, I want to ask you specifically about India's response, since you were not only running the central bank there, but you were also chief economic advisor at one point. So when India announced its nationwide lockdown last week, it gave 1.35 billion people just about 4 hours notice. And in doing so, it neglected 45 million migrant workers who had to rush home, and neglected a population of millions of homeless people, and not to speak of hundreds of millions of poorer Indians in slums for whom social distancing is an unimaginable privilege. So what do you think the lockdown does for the Indian economy, given the size of its informal sector, and can it even bounce back?
It's a great question. Actually, just before I get to that, just on the issue of keeping people in place, I mean, one of the things as time goes on is the structure of our economies may have to change. As Adam said, if we really don't have a handle on this virus at the end of a few months, then the question is, would we have to change the nature of work? Will the same industries sort of get revived? And so at some point, moving away from the old patterns of work and employment may be necessary. And so initially, the right answer is keeping everybody in place and employed, but over time, you may want to allow for much more flexibility and movement so that we are adapted to a different world when we actually. Now, turning to India, look, India is a huge country with fairly modest administrative capabilities, and you would have thought that a lot could have been put in place before the announcement of the lockdown. And of course, the issue of the migrants doesn't seem to have been fully thought through. What you saw is, without any announcement about how people will get food, how they will get incomes during the period of lockdown, when it was announced suddenly, a lot of people took fright. There is some argument that there was some misinformation also. Regardless, we did not do a good job of informing those migrants of how they would be taken care of. And it's not clear that there were sort of procedures in place to do that. And as a result, naturally, with no incomes coming in, they all decided to go back to their communities, their villages, where certainly they would have a far better chance of surviving this period. And of course, that defeats the purpose of lockdown, because what you've got is a lot of people crowded together in the cities now going crowded together to the villages and potentially spreading the virus there. So there's a lot that needs to be done in India. It's not clear what the alternative was, but in all these situations, we can certainly second guess and find lots of things that could have been done better.
Can I just add something on mobility, Ravi? I think that along with the employment issues that both Raghu and I have emphasized, this is something in many dimensions we're going to have to think about. Obviously, there are borders going up, there are social controls going up, there's unfortunate politics coming out against migrants even more. There's regionalization, that in Raghu's essay, he talks about some of the good aspects of that. There are also, of course, negative aspects of that. And so I think we need to be prepared for a world that emerges over the next few years that needs mobility, but is going to have a lot of constraints on mobility of people and workers. And that tension, I think, is going to be one of the underlying themes when you talk about changes in behavior.
Sure. Let's get to some questions now from our audience. We have many hundreds of people joining us from around the world. Lorenzo Ibrahim from Milan in Italy. He's asking about the ECB. And Adam, I'll pose this to you. Do you believe Eurobonds are the right way to tackle the current situation? What else can the ECB do?
I definitely believe that Eurobonds are the right way to tackle the situation. This is something I, and more importantly, many other European officials and politicians have been advocating for some time, because you do need some fiscal mutualization in the euro area to complete the monetary union, as the phrase goes, to make it more resilient, to make it more fair and politically sustainable. You can try to substitute for Eurobonds through other means. There are various proposals, including from the German government, but they won't do a fundamental fix to the problem. And they will, no matter what, carry some form of stigma, in the sense that it's then the Dutch or the Germans doing a favor on condition to the Italians and others, which is not helpful. I mean, it's helpful compared to doing nothing, but it is not as fundamentally helpful. So I really wish they were issuing special Eurobonds, as colleagues of mine like Jim Kierkegaard have advocated, as Phil Blaine, now the ECB's chief economist in the past, has advocated. Unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be political conviction on that or agreement on that. And instead, you'll get some partial measures which will help, but which will not serve the same purpose.
Thomas Cole, who is an ex-European Commission negotiator, he's based in London, he has a question which I'm going to pose to Raghu, and that is that what lessons can we draw from the policies taken after the 2008 financial crisis to help inform the responses taken by governments today? And he goes on to ask, is the 2008 financial crisis even relevant or helpful in thinking about today's response? Raghu?
Well, I think what it did was certainly the response then was a little bit of a playbook for the response now. I don't think, for example, the US would have moved as fast if it hadn't had the experience then. Certainly the US Fed rolled out some of the old programs and rolled out a few new ones. However, I would also add that one of the things we need to start thinking about is how often can we do this? Do what it takes, where we keep thinking this is the last big crisis and therefore we have to pull out all stops. But if it's 10, 20% of GDP every time, coupled with another 10 years of very easy money and a rise in leverage, are we actually solving the problem? And so one of the lessons from the last crisis is we ended up with the level of leverage that we have just before this crisis. And that's going to be a problem as we go through, including all the money that has flowed into emerging markets, but also the money that has flowed into corporations. So I think we need to really think about, yes, we need these emergency measures, but how do we get back to normal? And what else do we need to do? Can it just be a matter of monetary and fiscal stimulus, or is there something else we need to think about? Because we simply cannot afford to spend this amount of GDP every 10 years.
Sure. And Raghu, just to push you on that a little bit, because one of the things about this moment is that the ability to sort of conjure up $2 trillion out of thin air, and that's on top of large tax breaks. How does that change the conversation about what's even possible in DC? I mean, does it change the Medicare debate? Does it change other debates? I mean, do deficits just not matter anymore?
Well, we would wish that they would not matter. But I do think that while on the one hand, we certainly seem to be more confident, probably for good reason, that we can sustain higher levels of debt at these low interest rates. It is debt. It is an obligation. And of course, as you point out, there are so many other obligations which are mounting, especially as we get older. We thought we would be able to solve those problems, but since then we've seen an accumulation of debt which makes it harder to solve the entitlement problems that we have. So I do think that at the end of this, yes, we will do what it takes because you don't want the economy collapsing, but we have to sit back and think, how do we make it more sustainable? What is it that we need to do to ensure that, one, we're prepared for these shocks by bringing down debt before it? And second, how do we make sure that all the other problems that we had, the huge level of entitlements that are unfunded, all those get taken care of before it's too late?
Can I add two things quickly, Ravi? First, the issue of sustainability and fiscal policy has to be addressed, but there has to be a new definition of what constitutes fiscal responsibility in this world. And I think it's important to recognize that most rich country governments, unlike the US, run much more generous welfare states and much more generous safety nets and have more resilience of that sort, despite having lower debt to GDP ratios. So in addition to Raghu saying we can't keep doing this, we don't have to keep doing it this way in the US. And I'm hoping that this event pushes us in that discussion. It may be more a question of raising taxes and in progressive fashion than cutting back on entitlements. It may be hand in hand doing both, not cutting back, but paying for them more. The second point is just in terms of the debt, there I differ slightly from Raghu. I'm less worried about the private sector debt than he is, and I view this problem as less about that. I think the emerging market capital flows is a big deal. But on the private sector side, we know from Germany, from Italy, from Japan, from China, that you can sustain zombies rolling over debt for them a long time and keep companies in business. We, myself included, the majority of the profession have viewed this as a mistake. It's very inefficient. But as productivity levels have come down in the US, as dynamism has come down in the US for going on nearly 2 decades now, you have to ask, how much are we gaining by giving up on the resilience this kind of zombie, as it were, support allows? So I think we do, as you say, have to do some fundamental rethinking.
Sure. Adam, I'm going to stick with you for a 2-part set of questions on China from our listeners in. One is from Trudy Rubin of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and she wants to ask how the pandemic will accelerate a decoupling between the United States and China. And linked to that, Dr. Kalina Zekova from the University College of London asks how you see China's role in a post-pandemic global economy being any different from what it is now?
Those are great questions, and they're things we at the Peterson Institute are working very hard on. So no definitive answers, but what I would say first, the first question was on China's,
on decoupling.
Decoupling, right. Sorry, my brain just froze because we're working on it so much. On decoupling, I think the decoupling in terms of supply chains, in terms of technology transfers, in terms of human integration, not in the personal sense, but in the corporate investment sense, was already had a huge momentum in Washington across both parties. To a degree I found exaggerated and unfortunate, but that's the reality. This will only feed that trend in the US, and it will also feed China's sense that they have less to gain and less to initiate from the US. I'm not sure whether this becomes unpeaceful or conflictual. I hope not, but I do think that that form of decoupling will accelerate, and it's much more about the lack of competition in ideas, the lack of transfer and flow in ideas and people that is going to be harmful than some of the trade shifts. In terms of China's role, I would just say briefly, if you believe that the US government under Trump is going to try to block China from being as assertive in the IMF and in international finances as they seem to be wanting to block, then I think we get a division in the world where many of the poorest countries in the world will turn to China for help, and it will come with strings. It will be still accepted, and that will change the landscape quite a bit.
I have a question from Antoine van Ochtmeil, who is asking about emerging markets. He, of course, coined the phrase, the term emerging markets. And he says that, those markets won't escape the coronavirus crisis, despite a possible climate advantage, which has not been proven yet. But they will have the advantage of learning the lessons of mistakes made in developed countries at the early stages in dealing with the early infectious nature and spread in hospitals. And to add to that, also in how they're responding at an economic level. Raghu, do you think that those lessons will be important? Can they be applied? Do you think the fact that this hit the developed world before it's going to hit African and South Asian and Southeast Asian economies, do you think that wait time is going to be important?
Well, you would think that the time would give them the ability to prepare. I think there are a couple of things coming in the way. First, of course, is some leaders simply don't think that it is appropriate to take the same kinds of actions. Adam already talked about Brazil and Mexico. And so the extra time hasn't really bought them any ability to reverse this or fight the pandemic. The second is that there is a resource crunch across the world. I mean, everybody's looking for ventilators, everybody's looking for protective equipment, and the bans on exports across the world don't help. But essentially, emerging markets are coming to this buying frenzy late, and therefore there are also limited resources to go around. Of course, they have their own constraints, which we talked about earlier, the lack of resources, probably not for medical equipment, but more generally to do the same kinds of things that the industrial countries have done. So yes, they come into it with a little more information, but they come to it also with a lot less resources. The only hope is perhaps this virus is slowed by humidity and heat a little more, but that doesn't seem enough to be able to prevent really widespread spread in the emerging markets.
Right, and I should point out, for example, Singapore, which has an equatorial climate, has also seen a fair number of cases, although widespread community spread hasn't taken place there yet. We are at 11:30 now. I have gotten so many questions from the people who are listening in that I'm just going to pose a few more. Hal Kanan is asking, Adam, this one's for you. How will gold and oil perform in this crisis?
I think oil is going to keep where it is roughly. The collapse in demand, and it is a particularly transport-heavy collapse in demand, is likely to persist for some time, and that overwhelms anything that Russia and Saudi do or do not do to try to prop up oil prices. I'm not going to say it's going to stay at $20 a barrel, but it will remain low. Gold is going to fluctuate. We are not seeing the enormous uptick in flight to safety in gold that one has seen in the past, but I think with each successive crisis cycle, people are getting smarter and doing less of that. So I think, on balance, gold is probably going to do okay in this environment, but it's not going to be a hugely gaining asset class, nor should it be.
Tyler Russell has a question which I'm going to put to Raghu, and he says, who takes the initiative in the global economy in the wake of the pandemic? And just to add to that, Raghu, what's the role of big multilateral organizations like the World Bank or the IMF, which you've worked for, and others?
Well, the initiative was being taken by the G7 before the advent of the G20. And I think Gordon Brown led that meeting in 2009, which set the stage for the global reaction to the global financial crisis. This time around, we haven't seen such a global initiative yet. That is not to say it won't come, but the G20, the presidency is in the hands of the Saudis, and they have many things on their plate right now. So it doesn't seem as if there is coordination of the kind we saw in 2009. And of course, we have the G7, the US has not been a great fan of multilateral action. Nevertheless, we will need to see more because the stress on the emerging markets and developing countries is increasing. And I think the World Bank, the ADB, the African Development Bank, all of them will have to come together to create packages for many of the very poor countries who will be deeply stressed, at the very least enough to help them fight the crisis with medical resources, but also beyond that to deal with the economic problems that emerge. The IMF has about $1 trillion worth of firepower. Not all of it can be used, but it probably will need more at the end of this crisis. And hopefully, arrangements with the central banks working with the IMF and through the IMF can be a source of liquidity for some of the larger emerging markets. But for some of the developing countries, the IMF will have to put its resources to work. There's a lot of work to be done. And given the amount of capital flight from these countries, better sooner rather than later.
Sure. Mark McNamee is asking whether under a base case scenario, Adam, this is for you. Do you agree with the timeline of a global economic gradual recovery starting in Q3 and more or less normalization in Q4? So this really is another version of, are we going to see a V-shaped recovery?
I've been using everybody's got their image. I've been using the vision of the check mark, that it's down very quickly and then comes back at a still upward slope of less than half the downslope. And I think we're going to see a succession of check marks, one in East Asia centered around South Korea, Taiwan, China, and I hope Singapore and Japan, that will emerge towards the summer. And then ideally, again, dependent on the public health policies and the nature of the virus, that happening in the US. And by the time you put together those East Asian countries plus economies plus the US, that's a huge share of the world economy. Other parts of Europe may come along, but sorry to belabor this, this will be cascading, so it'll seem more gradual, and probably the spillovers, the positive spillovers from increased growth in East Asia and then US on the rest of the world will be lower than they have been typically in other crises. The final point is I am very fearful, going back to what Raghu was just talking about, I am very fearful that we start going towards lost decade territory, start of lost decade territory for the global south, the poorer countries, even if you get a recovery in the rich countries.
On that note, Raghu, I have a couple of questions from Anushka Saraswat in India, Lucy Kolbach, a freelance journalist. Lucy cites your book Fault Lines, in which you talk about the flexible employment model in the US, given its more mature economy, but you've criticized the social security safety net. And her question is whether you think that this crisis might finally push the US towards that more sort of interventionist model that you envisaged. And as you're thinking about that, Anushka's question was whether this is going to change supply chains for the West.
Well, on the first, I think Adam has already hinted, which I agree, that there will be a rethinking. Now, which way that rethinking goes, I don't know, but we will have to rethink, our safety nets in every country, including, I think, the medical safety net in the U.S. and how effective it is, especially in this world of pandemics. Now, the U.S. has historically come up with sort of a contingent increase in the safety net. When needed, we enhance it, and then it goes back to the old. And the question is whether it'll go back to the old. My guess is we will certainly have resistance to going back to the old system in full measure. On the issue of supply chains, almost surely every company is now thinking, have I sacrificed sustainability and safety for somewhat lower costs? At what price do I buy do I buy efficiency? How much safety do I sacrifice? So almost surely what we'll see is supply chains, a tendency to bring them in, but of course, bringing them in will be very costly. So a tendency to make supply chains more diversified, have more sources of supply across the world, and make sure they're not in the same country or economic region, so that they're not affected by the same forces. So there'll be a lot more rethinking of supply chains. That's opportunity for some and cost for others.
We are almost out of time. Couple of quick more questions. Adam, this is coming to you. Dominic Chan is asking whether you think an agricultural based economy will do better in these circumstances. And as you chew on that, Umlaut Mandraker is asking whether all of these stimulus measures are going to cause inflation or hyperinflation.
Let me take those in opposite order. On inflation, there are credible people now who are starting to worry about that. I think despite the arguments they're going to be proven wrong, I could see in some of the rich countries a very short burst of one-time price increases when there is a mismatch between the demand that comes back quickly and the restarting of the economy, the gaps in the economy created by the coma and the recessionary feel for many people. But ultimately, there's just not going to be any wage pressures in this world, in this environment. There's going to be a lot more saving by people, is my assertion going forward. And the people of the developing world are going to be desperate for work and exports. So to me, I think we've seen the death, or should have seen the death, of very monetary visions of inflation over the monetary driven visions of inflation over the last 15 years. And this may be the final proof. Sorry, first, agricultural economies. I know less about that than other people on this call. I would just say that I think obviously local food supplies, the ability to produce them, sustain them reliably, relating to the things that both Raghu and I have said about supply chains, that there will be buildups of some stockpiling and specialized relationships, but of course you cannot stockpile food in the 7 fat years for the 7 lean years, except very special types. So potentially agriculture as a sector does better in coming years, additionally under pressure from climate change. But at the same time, there are many things associated with predominantly agricultural economies not usually having the support infrastructure for their people that the economies that are more diversified do. And so I bet more thinking in terms of agriculture than thinking about agricultural economies.
Thanks, Adam. I just want to point out that, we're doing lots of these calls at FP, and they're very useful to our readers and subscribers. Next week, we have a discussion that's going to be focused on the oil markets, and we're going to be joined by Keith Johnson, who is based in Madrid. He's one of FP's senior staff writers and closely follows the oil markets. We'll also have Halima Croft, who's the managing director and global head of commodity strategy at Global Research, RBC Capital Markets. I think it's time to wrap up now, but before I let you both go, Raghu, you have an essay that just published this morning in Foreign Policy. It's part of our cover package for our next issue, which is called The End of Globalization. And your essay, and this was all conceived before the pandemic really took off, but your argument was that there are all these cracks in globalization, in part because of automation and urbanization. And you were arguing that the way forward is to boost local government as a way to sort of shore up the problems within globalization. Now, this pandemic is only going to make all those problems you were discussing worse, or at least catalyze other problems. Do you want to very quickly just give us a sense of your argument in that article?
Well, very quickly, it's that what globalization has done is taken away agency from people, the ability to react, because typically globalization also involves the integration of markets, but also the integration of government, because markets like to have common government across various areas. So we've essentially taken power away from the local and taken it up to the national and then the international. And as a result, we have these massive forces hitting us, and you need many local solutions, of course, helped by national governments wherever necessary. But it has to be much more local initiatives to deal with these problems. And yet we have local bodies totally disempowered. So the right kind of schooling locally, the right kind of healthcare, all those issues have been taken in many countries away from local bodies. And it may seem paradoxical, but I actually think for a viable globalization, we need much more localization. We need to resist the forces that continuously push us towards more integrated government. I mean, take the coronavirus problem. I mean, obviously, what we have today is a situation where everybody's in lockdown. But you see local communities coming together, on the net and trying to find out who's hurt, who has difficulty. And you have services starting up for elderly people who can't go out, getting them their food and medicines and so on. That's the way the community fills in the holes left by the markets and the government. And there's much more that can be done. And that will, in my view, make globalization much more palatable and not get the kind of reaction we have. Of course, as Adam said earlier, there are problems with communities also. I'm not I'm not seeing communities without seeing their problems. But we need to think much more, how do we deal with the problems that society has? How do we make it much richer society? And coronavirus has just highlighted that.
I urge all of our listeners in today to go to foreignpolicy.com and read that essay. You'll find it on the magazine tab, slightly lower down the webpage. It is truly a really important essay that I think countries and governments all over the world should contend with because of the recommendations that it puts forward. That's all we have time for today, I'm afraid. Thanks to all of you who've been able to join us and stay tuned in. Hundreds of you have stayed in through the call. Thank you so much to Raghuram Rajan and Adam Posen for joining us and sharing their expertise. For those of you who were with us, a recording of this webinar will be available quite shortly on foreignpolicy.com/live. And as a reminder, participation in these calls is a benefit of being an FP Insider subscriber, along with access to all of FP's other data-driven intelligence. You can find out more on foreignpolicy.com/FP Insider. Remember, next week we have a call focused on the oil markets. I'm Ravi Agrawal. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Thanks again to Raghuram Rajan and Adam Posen. More soon. Stay safe.